Welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit, and this is my good friend Ajay. And Ajay, while prepping for this episode, or rather reading your prep for this episode, I came up with a new frame with which I can think about myself. I realized that when I was much younger than today, long years ago, when I was 15, 16, 17, I was a rebel without a cause, or if we wish to alliterate, a rebel without restraints. And life has changed me. Today, I am not a rebel without restraints, but a rebel with rules. And I think this is a damn good thing because rules can make rebellion more effective. So, what do you, and gentle readers, you will find out by the end of this episode what I mean with these phrases and why they matter. But what is your sense of this?
I remember when Rock was young, me and Susie had so much fun.
So, Ajay, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about a important and great contribution by my clan of economists to political philosophy. Okay, at the heart of political science, if you had to pick like one organizing idea of political philosophy, it is this problem of the strong man. Okay, so all of us, we start as little clueless children, and we think that there should be a state which is run by a strong man, and we think that will be a Ram Rajya. Okay, and all of growing up is about understanding how this actually doesn't work well. And so I want to show it in sequence. We go through three stages of that reasoning. So stage one of that reasoning is what I call public choice theory, but it also has many other roots in the world of political philosophy, which is the idea that the strong man is not a Ram. Okay, the strong man is a regular guy. The strong man has wants and needs and makes mistakes just like everybody else. And so living under the absolute power of a strong man is nothing less than a nightmare. Okay, so you should have no illusions about wanting a strong man. It is going to be terrible for you. Okay, so nobody will have a happy life when there is a strong man. And so this takes us to the original political philosophy ideas of checks and balances, rule of law, dispersion of power, all that stuff, just from a very simple idea that your strong man is not going to be anywhere as good as you liked. And weak men is the way a government works well. Okay, so weak leaders is what works well in human societies. And most of India suffers from the delusion that a strong leader is a good thing, and this is just garden variety. Okay. Level two is an argument rooted in public administration. So here we're not on ethics and political philosophy, we're on practice, we're on getting things done. Government is a large complex organization. You have tens of thousands of employees. Sometimes you even have millions of employees in some really large countries. How do you overcome the principal agent problems of all these people? How do you do management? Okay, there'll be some state functionary sitting somewhere in a faraway place. What are they up to? How are they wielding the monopoly of violence? Are they just degenerating into corruption? Are they doing inconsistent things? Is your little village strongman different from my village strongman? See, because strongmen are not just tyrants at the top level. All their minions become tyrants in their own way. You become an entire state filled with ugly tyrants who are kicking around people wherever they are. You want consistency. So if you were a strong man, you would be saying, I want to have a say on what my minions are doing everywhere. And the most important beginning there is Julius Caesar. Okay, so make no mistake about it, Julius Caesar was no democrat. In fact, Julius Caesar destroyed the republic. Okay, so this is just one of the pivotal moments in world history where Rome had started learning how to do dispersion of power. Julius Caesar destroyed the republic. I also happen to consider him one of the greatest human beings who ever lived. He is just an amazing, fascinating person. But he destroyed the republic and he was one of the great thinkers of the world. He had this clarity that I run the Roman Empire. I don't want minions to independently choose how to wield my coercive power. And that's where the word law came in. So he started writing laws. He started writing process manuals because he wanted all his minions to operate under his authority in ways defined by him, not uh, at the discretion of the local tyrant. Okay, this is called rule by law, meaning Julius Caesar is not enveloped in law. Julius Caesar has no checks and balances. He has arbitrary power, but He wants everybody else to operate in a predictable rules-based way. Why? Because he wants the authority. Okay, so this is a level 2 argument that you're better off with rules rather than discretion, because the strongman wants the power to write the rules and he does not want independent authority at the hands of every minion. Okay, so this is a level 2 public ad reasoning, that it's better to have a world of rules even when you are suffering from a strongman. In this episode today, we're going to show a third and distinct line of reasoning which emanates from economics. Okay, so just like we economists take some credit for public choice theory, this is something created entirely by the economists, which is the idea that the state becomes more effective, not less, when it shackles its own hands with rules and takes away discretion. And this is widely inconsistent with the intuition of most people, certainly most civil servants. Okay, most civil servants subscribe to a certain kind of machismo that, me, I'm the guy, me myself, I get to decide. Various supplicants come to me, ask for a favor, and I bestow those favors. And that's not an intellectually correct line of argument. And today we're going to show a body of knowledge around this.
So I want to zero in on a couple of things here. And point one is that we instinctively prefer strong men or even strong women sometimes, especially if they are from a family of an earlier strong man. And it's interesting to think about why that is. We did an episode about economic fallacies that you should avoid and spoke about how those fallacies arose from the way that we were hardwired in prehistoric times. And, our genes were shaped in prehistoric times, which are very different from the modern times we live in now, where there were tribes of a few people, maximum 100, 150. Top-down thinking worked, right? A lot of the world was zero sum. For me to gain, you had to lose. For my tribe to, progress, the other tribe had to be slaughtered or whatever. So we instinctively, developed these fallacious ways of thinking, zero sum thinking, top-down thinking, and so on and so forth. So this attraction towards a strongman leader is baked into us, and we have to fight it, and that's important to note. Secondly, I want to clarify that when you said we want weak leaders, what you did not mean, obviously, is that we want leaders who are weak of character or weak of intellect. Not at all, quite the opposite. But what we meant was that we want leaders whose ability to act on their wishes is restrained by a set of laws, a set of circumstances. James Buchanan, one of the guiding lights of public choice theory, in fact, used to talk about the importance of exactly the subject we'll be speaking about, which is rules, not discretion. And his point was, and this is a great learning, is that you should design a system which is so strong with such checks and balances built in that if the worst person you can imagine is in charge, they can't do much damage. Whether it is Hitler or anyone, if that person rises to the top, your system is so solid, it's so well designed with institutions and checks and balances, and a limit to state power that you can't do much damage. And that is what we mean by a weak leader. And the third thing I'd like to draw your attention to is a phrase that he used in Caesar's case, rule by law. There's a distinction between rule by law and rule of law. Rule by law is a strongman sits on top of the state and decides that, okay, I will make all these laws, these people have to do all of these things. But he is not subject to them. Rule of law means that even he is a subject to the laws of the nation, as it were, and can't do anything about them. So that's a distinction that will become clearer and clearer as this episode goes on.
Yeah. And just here's another quick intuition. When an individual goes up to the strong man and asks for a wish, okay, is the strong man able to bestow that wish? Okay, like straight out of Hindu mythology. And a good country is one in which the strong man can do very little.
So, Ajay, today I shall ask you to be a storyteller, that rather than just talk about the ideas in an abstract sense, make it come alive for me in a concrete way by telling a story. Let's go.
Let's consider the taxation of corporations. Okay, so a great success story in this is the country of Ireland. What Ireland did was it established a very low corporate tax rate. And then global companies chose to put factories and offices into Ireland, and it really powered great Irish growth. Okay, as an aside, one day we will talk more about taxation in EIE, and I strongly would recommend this for India. That it's wise to have very low corporate taxation, ideally zero corporate taxation, and attract all the companies of the world saying, please come. build factories in this country, build offices in this country. It makes jobs for our people. Ireland did this with great success. Now consider the situation, a hypothetical situation, that there is a great problem in the country, there is an economic downturn, or there was a great earthquake, the people are suffering. Okay. Suppose a policymaker says that, yeah, normally we have a corporate tax rate of 5%, but in this exigency, it's a special moment, the people are hurting. Just for 2-3 years, I'm going to push up the corporation tax rate. Okay, and the reasoning, the clever policymaker, okay, it's Indian IAS level of IQ. The clever policymaker says, see, these guys are here. They're my hostages. The factories are already here. The offices are here. They can't leave. Okay, Ireland is established as a very important country where all kinds of corporations are putting their offices. So if I expropriate a little bit of money from them for a couple of years, they'll understand. And after all, the weak must bear what they must. So this is the kind of reasoning that takes place where the policymaker tries to respond creatively, opportunistically to a situation. Being very clever, understanding the lay of the land that, okay, I'm going to sock these people and expropriate them. But you know what? It's all going to work out okay because they have no choices. They are already here. Are they going to up their factory and leave? No. So they are helpless. I can just grab their money. This is the way economics used to think all the way until the 70s. This kind of reasoning was normal amongst the thinkers and the researchers of economics all the way till the 1970s. And here's an alternative way to think about it and the correct way to think about it, which is that fine, you had a 5% income tax rate, the corporation tax rate, and many firms established operations in Ireland. Now for firms, investment is a very long-term journey. Firms invest on 5-year, 10-year, 25-year horizons. So in a spreadsheet, that's an investment calculation. You are really projecting the profits of the project into 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, and NPVing all that and looking for what's the return on equity that would emanate from an investment decision. This is what everybody does. If you sock those people once, first, they get pissed off because their entire calculations got disrupted. It's like, hey, dude, I had built this factory planning that it was going to be like a 8% ROE in dollars, and you've just converted it to 6% ROE in dollars. And that's material. It changes the logic of everything that I was supposed to do. Further, when a government will behave like this, it loses trust. Because now the private sector starts thinking that, oh, you socked me once, maybe you'll sock me again. If you're capable of opportunistic behavior once, you're capable of opportunistic behavior again. Suddenly, the whole power of offering a 5% corporation tax rate gets diminished. So you thought that, wow, I have 5% corporation tax rate. It is supposed to exert an incentive impact upon the corporations of the world. So think, what is the bang for the buck you were getting? Okay, the state established a policy with the desire of attracting investment. How large was the investment flow that was attracted? Whereas when you do this opportunistic behavior, now suddenly that same policy becomes less effective. The state loses power by being opportunistic. Okay, so this is a lovely intuition that you think that you are being very clever, and in an exercise of machismo, you wield the state power, you respond with discretion, you opportunistically sock the corporations because there is a great drought in the country. And what it is actually doing is it is damaging the response that was intended by a low corporation tax rate in the first place. Now for years and years, people have long memories that, yeah, these people, they say 5% corporation tax rate, but you can't trust them. There was this period, they stole so much money from the companies, and who knows, they may do it again. It was a very popular move. They got praised in the press for doing this. They won an election for doing this. And now suddenly the next 25 years are more cloudy because now the private sector is trying to reason, under what conditions will they expropriate me? How much will they expropriate me? What realistic corporation tax rate should I put into my spreadsheet? What safety factor should I put in? What higher return on equity do I require to pay for the risk that I'm taking? Okay, so this is a nice canonical example where we see that the introduction of opportunistic behavior reduces the power of the policy. The policy maker, the state, becomes less effective by being more opportunistic.
So, you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of poker. Poker taught me many lessons about human nature. We have an episode on poker here as well. And let me give you an example of a mistake that people sometimes make in poker, right? There is game theory optimal poker where you just play a particular way, you're not trying to exploit the other person. That's played by very few people in practice, and we've discussed that in our episode on poker. But otherwise, most poker is exploitative, which means that if I am sitting with a bunch of people at a poker table and trying to figure out how to play, I will look for mistakes that they are making on a recurrent basis and try to exploit those. So, for example, if everyone on the table is folding too much, in other words, if they're tight, I will start loosening my range and opening with hands I really shouldn't be opening with, and vice versa as well. You play loose on a tight table, tight on a loose table. If someone is bluffing too much, I'll try to exploit that person by, calling more, and so on. And here, a bad player can often make a fundamental assumption that I've found a mistake, I've exploited it, now I'm going to make money. But actually, no, because the other person adjusts to your adjustment, which is why exploitative poker is also automatically exploitable poker, right? If the table is playing too tightly and I loosen my opening range, then somebody will notice I've loosened my opening range and they will re-raise me over the top and take money off of me because I can't stand the heat. And they themselves may have nothing, but they may be exploiting me, and someone else may be canny enough to see that and exploit them further, right? Which is why in poker, back in the day, I remember in the 2000s, I was reading one of the canonical books on poker, and that said that a four bet, right? A four bet basically is if you raise, somebody raises you, another person makes a fresh raise, you know, two bet, three bet, four bet, So when you re-raise a re-raise, that canonical book said it is almost always aces. But by the time I was a professional poker player, it was a lot of the time it was just nothing. You're just
People had
exploiting the other
understood
guy
this.
who's
Yeah.
exploiting the
Everybody
other guy.
read the book and said, "Oh, I can exploit this."
I mean, they just used the math. They did what you would have done. You would not have bothered with that canonical book and just figured out the math quite exactly. And the fundamental lesson in this is that people respond to your actions, that people change. You can't just assume that the world is a certain way. I will do something to exploit the way that it is now, and the world will stay the way it is and not change at all. Human beings are complex, they don't do that. Even that fallacy that things are going in a particular way and you say ki theek hai, at 5% tax rate I'm making so much, maybe at 15% I should make 3 times that much, which is nonsensical thinking. If you raise it too much, your overall tax collections will actually go down because people will adjust their behavior, as it were. In the 70s, Indira Gandhi, you will remember, had a maximum tax rate of, I think, 97%. We weren't a booming economy. We weren't doing so well.
Yeah.
So, people should take this into account that rational people, and we're all rational, respond to incentives. And the world changes with every action every individual takes.
And everything you said is precisely the journey of ideas where this story took place, that all the way till the 60s, the behavior of economists was that the state is very smart, is optimizing, is figuring out optimal policies, and the people are dolts. Okay, and my personal slogan is derived from Shakespeare. Okay, Mark Antony says in Julius Caesar, he says to the people, to the mob that is gathered around Caesar's corpse, says, "You are not wood, you are not stones, but men. And being men, it will inflame you, it will make you mad." So when I heard this, well, I knew this as a child, but when I became an economist, I adapted this, that you are not wood, you are not stones, but men. And being men, you will optimize. Okay, and so the whole essence of modern economics, and this is called the rational expectations revolution. People disown the phrase rational because it lays claim to complete optimal rationality, complete optimal Bayesian reasoning. I don't think that's the essence of it. The essence of it is people are watching, people are smart, people are self-interested, they are trying to grok the world, and they will use all knowledge reasonably well. Now, they are not computers, they are not perfect Bayesian optimizers, but they are not dolts either. So in the example that I showed you, I think it's elementary and reasonable that when you expropriate firms by giving them a sudden high tax only for 3 years, help the people, there are so many homeless people, the firms don't take it lying down. It changes their risk perception about the state. And in the future, for every investment decision, they're not going to dumbly take a 5% tax rate playing out into the rest of time. They will either put in a somewhat higher tax rate, just a safety factor, and or they will layer a risk premium into their cost of capital of equity capital. So these adjustments are going to happen for sure. And this is the point of the great development of economics in the late 60s and early 70s, where economists started taking this stuff seriously and started grappling with this.
So, Ajay, tell me the next story.
The next story is monetary policy. In a good world, you want the central bank to take responsibility for inflation and promise that I am here and I will stabilize inflation. So, yeah, things will happen occasionally. Sometimes there'll be deep trouble in the economy. At that time, I'll cut rates to prop up the demand side of the economy, and then inflation will come back. Sometimes the economy will overheat. At that time, I'll raise rates. But my job is I will deliver stable inflation. Now, the moment you establish this kind of rule set, a whole bunch of good stabilizing things happen all over the economy. I want to just single out two. The first of them is that imagine you're a firm, okay, and you face some idiosyncratic shocks that maybe one particular raw material of yours became more expensive, or in one region, the wage hikes became a little more than normal. Your mind is grounded that India has 4% inflation. So it stabilizes your willingness to be trigger happy and raise your output prices. Okay, so that is the first great thing that happens, that firms don't respond that much to idiosyncratic price shocks. They instead, their minds are anchored that, look, normally inflation is about 4%, and so I'll have a strategic view of my price raises, and that actually stabilizes the entire economy. All firms behave in more normal ways. A second element of this is in the bond market. The long-term interest rate on long-dated bonds is entirely a play on inflation. If you have confidence about inflation for the next 25 years, then you have confidence on what interest rate you require for a 25-year loan or a 25-year bond. So this is how stability around the prospects for inflation really impacts deeply upon the entire economy. Individuals all over the economy change their behavior when it's wired into them that, look, inflation, it's going to be 4%. Don't think about it. And then in this, you get the temptation to exploit this. Okay, so what is exploitative behavior by the policymaker? Exploitative behavior by the policymaker is the idea that, sometimes there has been a bad situation in the country. Either you get bleeding heart arguments, oh, poor people are not feeling good, or there's an election next door. Okay, public choice theory. These things will always be used in the most venal ways possible. So then there will be a situation where, like, there was an oil shock in the 70s, and in America, the policymakers thought, oh, it is so bad. Already people are paying more for petrol, and the country is suffering. Unemployment has already gone up. If we raise rates more, we are adding to the misery of the common people. So, very welfareist language started creeping into this stuff. So the policymakers thought, let's let it go. That, okay, it'll be a little bit of inflation for some time, but let the central bank not add to the pain of the economy by raising rates at times when times are already difficult. Okay. But the thing is, once you do this, you have unhinged the expectations of the economy. Now the firms are thinking, oh, you mean inflation is not guaranteed to be 4%. And the bond market is thinking, oh, you mean inflation is not guaranteed to be 4%. And now suddenly behavior all across the economy changes, and it goes badly, and it goes in ways that are harmful for growth. So this idea of rules rather than discretion really took root around the field of monetary policy, where modern thinking is the job of the central bank is to deliver an inflation target. Okay, so in India, we have an RBI Act. The law says RBI is held accountable for delivering 4% inflation. And then you should not care whether there is an election next door, whether there is a crisis in the economy, whether there has been a great drought. You must deliver 4% inflation. That the highest contribution that the Indian central bank can make to growth in India is to stabilize everybody's mind that inflation will be 4%. Then everybody will make their plans, and it's going to take decades to earn the confidence of people, because the inflation targeting regime came only recently, and RBI's performance on living up to the inflation target has been middling. They have chased extraneous objectives like the exchange rate and so on. It's going to take decades to stabilize the mind of the individual and the pension planner and the long-term firms of India. So we ain't remotely done. But this is the journey, that our job is to mess with the minds of the people to the point where the people just feel that certainty that inflation 4%. I don't need to think about it. I don't need to nervously worry that will RBI actually live up to its law, or will it play truant and go do some other things.
So, this is a good time, gentle readers, to recommend our great episode on inflation targeting. Let me inform you that Ajay was one of the thinkers who, from the 1990s onwards, was recommending inflation targeting and pushing for it. And just that journey of a good policy becoming law took like more than a decade and a half, just took ages and ages and ages. Change happens at a glacial pace. So, gentle readers, Ajay Shah reads papers the way other adolescent boys watch porn, right? You just dive deep into papers all night. You can't help it. You'll be like, let me just look at one paper at maybe like 9 p.m. And before you know it, it's 4 a.m. and you're still like, you've gone through 40 papers and etc. etc. And I know how much this particular paper excited you. So tell me a little bit more about this paper and how it's such a genuine contribution to the evolution of this idea of rules plus discretion.
This is a 1977 Journal of Political Economy paper by a Norwegian economist, Finn Kydland, and an American economist, Ed Prescott. I think you have met our friend Rajneesh Mehra. Rajneesh Mehra co-authored an amazing paper with Ed Prescott, which is called The Equity Premium, a Puzzle. Both Finn Kydland and Ed Prescott are Nobel Prize winners in economics for this paper. And this, as I said, was published in 1977. It's part of that 1968 to 1977 period of amazing evolution of ideas around the rational expectations revolution, where economists went away from the notion that you could exploit the credulous people towards the idea that the people are rational, optimizing actors who don't merely look back and dumbly model the world as a regression done on the past data, but have their eyes open, are looking forward at the world, are understanding ways in which the world is changing, ways in which the policymaker is changing, and using all this information every day to change their behavior on a decision like a housing start, on a decision like refinancing a home loan, on the decision of every firm about how to operate. People are smart and people are trying to think every day. And so this was the rational expectations revolution. For me personally, this was first year PhD coursework, and I was just like a happy, giddy child studying microeconomics and macroeconomics in the first year. In preparing for this episode, I had an anxiety attack that is there something I've forgotten about Kydland and Prescott. So at 7 a.m. today, I went back to read the paper once again, and I was happy to know that, yeah, I knew everything, but I also just got a little drunk with happiness because just the whole memory, the feeling of being in first year PhD and discovering these things for the first time came back to me, and it was just like happy days. So once you get into this way of thinking, it triggers off a whole bunch of associated ideas, all of which are equally important. So the first idea is our traditional conception of doing public policy is that I look at the world and I make a decision, I take an action. Okay, it's one action at a time. Whereas rules rather than discretion makes us think that the action is actually baked into the rule, or should be baked into the rule. So the work of doing public policy is actually more meta. It is about imagining one rule at a time. So we should be debating rules, that should you have an exchange rate target or should you have an inflation target is a good and interesting discussion. We have an EIE episode on the exchange rate, the most important price of the country. That's an interesting debate. That's real public policy. For the rest, once you've arrived at a rule, civil servants, politicians should actually be largely tied down that if X state of nature arises, you will behave in Y manner. It's not like you have a day-to-day discretion. So again, it is a hallmark of primitive governments that they are not tied down by rules, by laws, by institutions, but rather have day-to-day discretion that I see this situation, what should I do? It's up to me. I can decide. I am the arbiter. I can shape a decision A versus decision B, which are vastly different. Whereas in a rules versus discretion worldview, we shift gears that the job of doing policy is devising policy rules. It's a very intellectual project of imagining what are the appropriate rules. And then once you make those rules, the day-to-day life of the policy maker or the civil servant and the politician operationalizing those rules is just living up to a publicly stated manual. Okay. The second piece of knowledge around this is the words credibility and commitment. Okay, so Kydland and Prescott forced us to start taking the words credibility and commitment seriously. So your power comes from your credibility, your power comes from your commitment. When you will opportunistically jump from one position to another, that one day there's a tariff, one day there's no tariff, one day there's a tariff, one day there's no tariff, then you lose credibility, that you have no commitment. Who knows, anything can happen. The private sector just starts pushing up their ex ante uncertainty higher and higher. Whereas power of the state comes from credibility. I said that I will do this and then I did this and I lived up to it for a long, long time. So in the world of inflation targeting, there's a beautiful slogan. We say that say what you will do and then do what you just said. That it's endlessly that game of publicly announcing and then doing it, publicly announcing and then doing it, that have no gap between words and deeds. Again, this is not how bad governments work. Bad governments think that they can maintain a distinction between propaganda and actions. And so you get the modern phrase, watch not what they say, but watch what they do. Because modern populist regimes believe that they can run a world of propaganda that is decoupled from their actions. They can say one thing and do another. Actually, that doesn't go very far. The people are smart. The people understand. Kydland and Prescott emphasize the words credibility and commitment, that your rules-based world will achieve power when you are seen as being credibly committed to living up to those rules. When you exploit the people and inject a surprise, when you engage in discretionary behavior that was not supposed to have happened, then suddenly you lose power, you lose effectiveness. Then just people respond, oh, that was not what was promised to me. And then behavior changes, risk premia go up, you stop getting that beautiful low long-term bond rate, high investment rates, all those good things that were supposed to be induced. The third element in this is richness around the word rule. Okay, I don't want rules to be 160 bytes. First, rules can be complex. Okay, people are very smart, they can understand a complex rule chain. So for example, there are people who have proposed that imagine a government bond which has the property that when GDP growth goes below 0%, the government bond will pay zero interest. Okay, now that's complicated. That, oh, in a normal year, there is positive GDP growth, the bond will pay its normal interest rate. But if real GDP growth goes negative, in that year, the bondholder will not get paid. So I'm promising this upfront. I'm writing it into the bond document. You're allowed to go complexity, but you're not allowed to expropriate people. You can't suddenly tell the guy, oh, we had a bad year, so you know what, I'm just going to skip paying you interest this year. Reneging on people is not on. Opportunistically doing things is not on. You're allowed to make rules complex. So you make rules more complex, more complex, more complex, all that is permitted. Now you actually get to the frontier that, you come to a zone where it's very difficult to write down everything explicitly. Then if you are the policymaker, Amit Bhai, you are obliged to show your philosophy. You're obliged to write documents and do speeches where you show people how you think about the world, because it helps the private sector understand your cosmology and it helps them envision what you will do when faced with unexpected states of nature or scenarios that the private sector is imagining which have not yet occurred and you haven't applied your mind and you didn't write it into your rule. But it's good and important to talk about your principles, talk about your philosophy. And that is how you get very sophisticated, complex speeches of principles and philosophy, the likes of which have pretty much died down in India today. But these are important because they communicate your rule. Okay, again, we are living in a world where we hope that your words matter, and when you do a speech, you'll actually stand by it. Again, in a really third world country, the speech making can just be anything and the actions can be completely different. But what I'm trying to show you is where we would like the world to go, what Kirtland and Prescott mean for becoming a sophisticated country, that it's a world of rules and not deals. It's a world of rules and not discretion, where the state will not opportunistically exploit the private sector by inflicting surprises on them, where every day the state will renew its vows by talking about what it will do and then doing it what it just said. And it covers for unpredictable, unexpected states of nature by articulating principles and philosophy that go beyond the simple narration of a complex document like a negative GDP growth rate inducing a 0% interest payout. Finally, there's a beautiful concept that emanates from this literature, which is handcuffs as commitment devices. Okay, this is exactly opposite to the thinking of a strong man. How do you become more powerful by wearing handcuffs? What do I mean? What the state is short of is credibility and commitment. Okay, I say I'm the central bank, I say I'm going to live up to an inflation target. You're the private sector, you say I don't trust you. How do I convince you that I will live up to an inflation target? Answer, I get a series of handcuffs. Okay, so let's narrate the kinds of handcuffs which are commitment devices, that it is wise and efficient for the state to shed discretion, to shed power, to lose power, to create a series of provisions and mechanisms through which violating the rule will become unpleasant for the state. Okay, so let me describe some things around inflation and inflation targeting, but actually the principle of handcuffs as commitment devices is quite general. So step one, I don't trust you. Okay, the civil servant, the politician will opportunistically cut interest rates because an election is coming and you want to support the ruling party to win the election. I just don't trust you. How do we overcome that problem? One key answer is that the vector of political control, the vector of political interference into the Reserve Bank of India is the governor. Okay, the governor is an employee of the government. The governor is appointed by the Ministry of Finance, and the governor comes under political pressure from the Ministry of Finance. So, how do you reduce the power of the governor in the monetary policy decision? Okay, so I have a blog article on this around how do you create the monetary policy committee. Okay, and so very quickly, the headline I would put up is you have 4 independent private economists and 1 governor. Okay, so the governor doesn't control the decision, but there is a discussion, there's a debate. You look at conditions in the economy, and 5 people vote, and out of them, only 1, the governor, is susceptible to political interference. The other 4 are private people, they are less susceptible to political interference. And this is created by the designers of the monetary policy institutions in order to woo the private sector, saying, look, trust me, I'm not going to opportunistically exploit the power of monetary policy. Okay, here's another idea. Make it unpleasant when the inflation target is violated. Okay, so what ought to be done is that in New Zealand, there is a bonus that is given to the central bank governor and the deputy governors of the central bank when they manage to hit the target. And when they fail to hit the target, they lose money. And all this is done with press releases. Okay, so make it bad, make it humiliating, make it expensive to violate the inflation target. Similarly, in many countries, there is a concept of central bank writing a mea culpa letter to the Ministry of Finance, okay, which is supposed to lay out that, dear sir, I'm sorry, I failed, I did not deliver 4%. I went back and did a detailed analysis of what went wrong. Did I use bad data sources? Did I have bad forecasting models? Did I fail to analyze the economy correctly? Did I fail on the monetary policy transmission? You're supposed to think about monetary policy structurally. It is these 3-4 pieces, and identify which of the pieces failed. What remedial actions have I embarked on? Okay, and of course, a wise Ministry of Finance will release this document into the public. Make it painful, make it unpleasant, that there will be a mea culpa. And we've discussed this before. The most important currency that the leadership of such organizations works for is the respect of their peers. So these are devices that are written into laws whereby you are handcuffing yourself, that you're making it difficult, you're making it costly to engage in opportunistic behavior, to engage in exploitative behavior.
All of this is deeply insightful, and I'll think about it a lot more as time goes by. But the part that really strikes me, and that I want to underscore, is the point about communication. Like, too often, how do we think of political communication? We think of governance as being one thing, that this is what a government does, and we think of communication as akin to propaganda, akin to advertising, that the government is building a narrative about the things that it is doing and all of that. And the point that you have made, without saying it in so many words, is that no, communication is a part of governance. That if you communicate consistently and live up to your words, if your action follow your words and your words indicate what your actions are going to be, then you build trust. That trust leads to action within the economy. People behave accordingly, and you create a beautiful virtuous cycle. So you cannot simply say that I will do some things, and then propaganda can be anything, communication can be anything. Communication is central. It is so important, therefore, of a part of governance itself. It is not advertising, it is part of the product.
Yes. Great leaders have been eloquent. Okay. It is not an accident that chapter 1 of Salman Rushdie's edited book of Indian writing is tryst with destiny. Okay. So great leaders are that combination of the thinking and the articulation, and not articulation as propaganda, but really the subtle ability to convey complex ideas. Amit bhai, we shall have a future episode, which is actually more your skill than mine, but I just had an episode idea. The title of the episode is Legitimacy, Why and How. Okay, so legitimacy is something subtle and intangible. It's not a crude top-down imposition of power. It is when the people are in harmony with the project of the state, and then a lot of things work better. But I digress. Everything you said is precisely correct about communication. And now let me take an emerging markets view. Okay, so far I've given you kind of garden variety, Kidland and Prescott. You're in an developing country, you're in an emerging market. Okay, you're in a country like India. The state works badly, the people have even higher mistrust. So if you think German voters and German firms and German bondholders are skeptical about the claims of the German Bundesbank, then everything is 10x worse with the Indian voter and the Indian bond market participant and the Indian firm. In India, the people have astonishingly high levels of mistrust and disrespect in the Indian state, because the Indian state has a long history of doing bad things. So I would argue that we in India, to do good public policy, we need to amp up on the policy design and the commitment devices. It is even harder for an Indian policymaker to earn the credibility and the commitment. So the communication needs to work even harder. The handcuffs need to be even worse. The key persons in the right organizations need to do daily press conferences and unscripted town hall meetings where they face difficult questions and they articulate their philosophy of what is the rule that I am doing. You need to do more, not less, under Indian conditions. So Kidland and Prescott and rules and discretion should not be seen as something that is done in advanced economies. You need it even more in India, given the institutional mistrust.
Ajay, what you and I really care about is India's fundamental problem of poverty. We are still a poor country. We still have, hundreds of millions of people in poverty, despite the good job we did 91 onwards for 20 years since that time. And we've had episodes on development where we talk about the way forward is growth. That is the only way out of this. All of these ideas, rules, not discretion, tell me how it relates to that task of economic development.
So, Amit, I've used an example around the taxation of corporations. I've used an example around monetary policy. But actually, this stuff around rules and not discretion, around credible commitment, around handcuffs, around say what you will do and then do what you just said, all these ideas and principles are actually of first order importance to the very project of growth. Why? Let's go do the first principles reasoning. Where does growth come from? Growth comes from a large amount of labor and capital being controlled by high productivity firms. Okay, so you want high productivity firms and you want them to control vast amounts of labor and capital. That's it. That's the growth journey. All economic growth is about the emergence of these capable firms. Very well. Where do these firms come from? Firms don't come out of thin air. Firms come out of the blood, toil, sweat, and tears of private persons who devote their lives to building firms. Private persons commit their money, their intensity, their passion, their time, their children to the journey of trying to build firms. Okay, many firms fail, but the ones that succeed are really what makes the entire country. And these are very long term projects. Okay, Rome was not built in a day. It takes years and years and years of effort to build sophisticated firms. This is not some, quick and dirty startup thing where you build something ramshackle and get an exit at 10x. This is about the real hard work of building large complex organizations and polishing the arrangements inside the firm, the management, the incentives, the principal agent problems. We've done many EIE episodes on the complexity of these firms. These firms don't come out of thin air, they come out of immense effort. Now, why would a private person put in that kind of effort? It is entirely shaped by the environment of the state. When the state shows the willingness to expropriate, the willingness to opportunistically expropriate, the willingness to suddenly change rules of the game, the willingness to engage in industrial policy, the willingness to micromanage the procedures, the technology, to suddenly come out with one rule after another. Every time the government does this, you may think, oh, this is just right now. Some civil servant came out with this good idea. No, I'm helping the people. The point is, the private sector is not stupid. The private sector watches the patterns and forms a sense of uncertainty about the future. The private sector thinks, oh, you expropriated that person today, maybe you will expropriate me tomorrow. The private person thinks you created a monopoly PSU in that business, maybe you will create a monopoly PSU in my business. Okay? The private sector factors in the danger of the vulnerability to the business model in the future. Or, for example, foreign firms are systematically nervous that if I operate in India, will there be a national champion or an Indian company that will get the government to rig the game in ways that favor an Indian company at the expense of a foreign company? All these fears add up to a wet blanket. And they tell private people saying, be cautious, that you can't be so sure about the working of the Indian state. And so private people, Indians and foreigners, they become more cautious. They pull back. They do not commit themselves with their intensity, their money, their passion, their children into the journey of building great firms in India. People will hold globally diversified assets. People will do other things with their time, with their life, and there will be a more wait and see, and this translates into low GDP growth. So I have showed you the direct connection between the most important question in the world, that is economic growth for India, and the material of this episode, which is rules rather than discretion, credibility, commitment devices, communication. All this is the machinery through which we get to that end goal of high GDP growth.
So, Ajay, I have a bunch of thoughts around this. And thought number one actually has to do with one of the firm's episodes that we did, right? Which was Imperial plus Adaptive Firms, where you beautifully mapped out the evolution of Indian firms, where in, say, the 1980s and around that period, you have firms really being run by regional satraps according to whatever local conditions are, and they're doing everything, and it's not really centralized. And then you have the first great evolutionary shift away from that in the 1990s as global standards come in, a different view of management comes in, where firms are now operating more by rules that come from the top. like you mentioned in our first chapter over here. And those are sort of the imperial firms where a bunch of rules are set up at the top and they percolate all the way down. And that's exactly how they work. And that's a vast improvement on what was going on earlier because you have uniformity and there are certain best practices that you can scale in that manner. But the next shift that has happened with some firms and not happened with many firms is a shift from imperial to adaptive firms, where you do have the rules guiding you, but you also have local adaptability because conditions on the ground are always different from place to place. In a different episode on decentralization, you've spoken about how there are 30 varieties of Kit Kat in Japan, right? And many countries across the world have multiple varieties, but we have only one Maggie, one Kit Kat, etc., etc. And this kind of seems to speak to this fundamental tension between the idea of rules and discretion, where an argument could be that, hey, listen, rules are important, we completely get that, but if you become too rigid, then people on the ground aren't really adapting as much as they should. I did a recent episode with the military historian Probal Dasgupta, and in a previous episode of Everything is Everything, related the stories of Nathula and Chola in the battles of 1967 and 1965, how a local commander, General Sagat Singh, disobeyed an order from the high command. And that disobeying, because he understood local conditions, proved to be something that helped us enormously later. It was in national interest. And in the army, especially, and this, by the way, I discussed with Probal in great detail, so gentle readers can check that episode out. In the army, especially, where it is imperative to follow orders, you have to follow orders, otherwise the whole edifice can collapse. But at the same time, you also need that local discretion. It's almost in some sense strategy from the top, and tactics you have more flexibility. So how does one think about this? Is it the case, like my thinking aloud, my intuitive solution for this is that you build more and more complexity into the rules itself, because the rules determine when discretion plays a part and when it doesn't?
So, first on the military thing, what you said is precisely correct. And great militaries have this intimate richness that on some things you will completely obey the rules, on other things you have all the discretion, and this goes down layers. So there's strategy, there's operations, there is tactics. So the people making strategy have complete command of strategy, and they don't want the lower people to change the strategy. Strategy is what you play at high levels of time, force and space. But then what is the operational design happens at a lower level, and those people have the complete authority that what's an operation that will play towards that strategy that gets played at a lower level. Then an operation is initiated. Then you get to the lower levels where a division commander is thinking about what I can do, and so on. So there is this useful breakdown between who has what power. And this links to what I was describing as a rule, that a rule does not have to be 160 bytes. A rule can be 16,000 pages. Okay, but what is important in the Kidlin and Prescott sense, which is not relevant for a military question, is that that rule should be known to the people. That the people should know who you are, what you are doing, why you are thinking the way that you're thinking, what parameters you will look at in the world that will make you turn left versus turn right. So that the people are able to develop rational expectations about your behavior and optimize their own behavior. So the state is not a ruler. The state is a predictable agent of the people, and then the people are able to optimize their lives around the predictable behavior of the state. Another critical ingredient of what you just described is decentralization. So I agree completely. India is highly diverse, and so you should not have one size fits all. And a lot of India, way more than was ever intended in the design of the constitution, needs to be subnational. So you have some things at the union government. You want to do monetary policy, it's a union government question. A few things at the state government, most things at the city government, and then each city is responding locally. There's a city where malaria is a big problem. They will have a different approach to thinking about stagnant water in their city compared to a place in a desert where there is no stagnant water. So in fact, this desire for predictability and rules, and yet handling the heterogeneity of the world, is the logic of decentralization.
And I'm thinking aloud that the subsidiarity principle which you have spoken about is actually a good concept to be extended into this as well. For example, if I, look at the world in terms of, or look at what we do in terms of why, what, and how, the why should happen at the very top where the strategy is happening, if I'm just thinking in military terms. The what can be one level below that, but the how has to be at the local level because that's where the best local information would be. And I'm obviously being really
Yeah.
broad, but is that
Yeah. So just in addition to that intuition, I think of local priorities and local production technology. So if you're in Jaisalmer, what are your priorities? If you're in Bangalore, what are your priorities? So first, that is local. Each city knows its own misery, knows its own point of pain. And the second is, what are the tools available to you? What are the prices? What are relative prices? What can you do? Is highly variable from location to location. So the cost of a school teacher in Bihar is very different from the cost of a school teacher in Kerala. So you should not have one size fits all where every civil servant in India is paid the same.
my second question is also about firms in a sense. I understand the importance of having rules and the part that they play, but rules can often stifle you. Rules can often be a straitjacket, and Clayton Christensen wrote about the innovator's dilemma. And you often see there are these large companies like a Kodak, which actually has all the know-how to change with the changing times and go into the new field, in their case, digital photography. But they simply can't do it because they think in a particular way, their organization is set up in a certain way, there are rules in place for what kind of spending you can do on what, and priorities get dictated by how people are responding to incentives. And time and again, Netflix is, of course, an honorable example we've spoken about in our last episode. But time and again, you see great big companies which appear to be almost monopolistic at a certain point in time become irrelevant and crumble into the dust of yesteryears simply because they could not adapt. And part of it certainly is in terms of the rules and processes that, make them act in a certain way and don't allow for nimbleness. Like I think of Google that solved for this in a beautiful way, where at least in the early 2000s, they had this principle that a certain percentage of each employee's time could go into a passion project, which they would do with Google itself, and they could form a team around that and they could work around that. So you weren't just doing the main thing. You could also work on disrupting yourself. You would not have to go out and do that somewhere else. You could do it in Google itself, which I thought was very wise. And I think that, as the world evolves, as markets get globalized and decentralized, and, the complex interplay of globalization comes more and more into focus, I see that journey also where firms think in innovative ways of how we can adapt to all of this and how our rules can change from one bunch of rigid top-down rules to maybe rules that enable an ecosystem within the company where funky things can happen.
So everything you say about firms is correct, but when I try to transplant it into the world of government,
I was only asking about
yeah,
firms.
yeah. With firms, what you say is perfectly correct, that you need to undertake big strategy pivots from time to time. And the monomaniacal execution orientation, that shut up and execute, don't think, don't be entrepreneurial, don't think about strategy, this is just a very costly way of operating. In government, you go to the city of Liverpool, you go to the city of France. For hundreds of years, it's basically been the same. You want streets, parks, solid waste management, water and sanitation. So the problem statement doesn't change the whole lot. A little bit of technical change happens on how it's done. What you want is just endless humdrum, predictable, consistent delivery of some basics. So I think of government as basics. The only area where there is the closest analogy to what you describe is in military affairs, where there is always the danger that you're fighting the last war. We see this most vividly in the Russia-Ukraine war. After Russia invaded Ukraine, there has been just an immense innovation spiral. The long-awaited revolution in military affairs is truly upon us. And drones, precision-guided munitions have changed the modern battlefield unrecognizably. And nobody in the world knows how to fight this war to the extent that Ukraine and Russia know how to fight this war. So that's a place where you really have to be alert. You can't just keep on doing the old things that you were doing.
My third question is about government itself this time and not firms. It strikes me that building trust can take decades, but losing trust can take an instant. right? And we have seen that in India as well, where it is arguable how much trust the state ever built. But at this moment, the state has no trust at all. We have many episodes that talk about our growth episode from 91 to 2011. And one of the ways that it went bust was because of this vile, evil courtier called Pranab Mukherjee. And I cannot think of a person who has a nice thing to say about that man. But fundamentally, the narrative is this, that when the terrorist attacks in Bombay happened, uh, you know, the home minister wasn't doing a great job. He had to be shifted out. And, Manmohan Singh wanted to put his most capable person in the home ministry at that moment that was required. And it so happened that that was P. Chidambaram. And therefore, P. Chidambaram has to move out of finance. And then Sonia Gandhi decides that Pranab Mukherjee will take over the finance ministry, and he does. And because Manmohan Singh is having some health issues, he doesn't take it over himself. And Pranab continues for a while. And in that period, Mukherjee, who has no knowledge of economics whatsoever, comes up with one disastrous measure after another. And the one that sticks in my mind as something that can take us years and years, if not decades, to recover from is retrospective taxation. Retrospective taxation is such a horrible concept that a company has come in, it's operated in a certain way, and not only are you saying that in future we will tax you like this, but you're saying we have decided that this applies to the past also, and therefore you owe us dues of so much, and therefore pay up. Right? And this is absolutely despicable. It destroys trust, especially from foreign investors who we really need, and it takes a long time to build back. And the point is that if policy continues along these lines, and as we have discussed very often, it doesn't matter which political party is in power. Bad policy is bad policy. Good policy is good policy. In that 20-year period, 91 to 2011, we saw different parties in power, but all behaving with the best interests of the nation at heart. And that has kind of gone to hell since. And that's something that makes me feel really sad, that how long will it take till you build that trust? Because even now all kinds of arbitrary measures will come up. Sometimes, we were talking about how governance should lead communication. Sometimes it feels like communication leads governance, that you come up with a narrative that sounds good, India first and make in India, and then that drives governance, which is nuts to me, which is absolutely crazy. So how confident do you really feel about this? Because, as Buchanan would have said, that the constitution is everything, that's setting the rules of the game. We have a flawed constitution. It is what it is. There's no changing it now. If it changes, it might even change for the worse. So it is what it is. So how does one look at this? What is a glass half full? What is a glass half empty?
So I talked, for example, about inflation targeting, but inflation targeting is just a mere parliamentary law, and potentially somebody could amend it tomorrow. So I had a blog article on this a while ago based on discussions with Josh Feldman, which is the idea that policy is always an incomplete contract, that there is no pre-commitment because tomorrow the policy can change. Then comes the question, so how do you pour concrete? How do you make things last? How do things survive for decades and decades? And then this takes us to the answer that the owners, the protectors, the maintainers of a given policy system become very important. And this is a broader intellectual community. It's never one person in government who can anchor something and hold it there. Once again, a caricature of how many economists think about the world is that they will whisper in the ears of Aurangzeb and miraculously some policy will happen. But then on the other hand, Aurangzeb will wake up from the wrong side of the bed and do something strange, or somebody else will whisper into Aurangzeb's ear and he'll do something different. I mean, that's a terrible conception of how to do policy, and also that's not a reasonable description of the world. What makes sense, what works, is an intellectual community, is a broad intellectual consensus. And these are the things that hold things together. So, for example, we did an episode on pensions where I described a community effort where there was a whole bunch of people that developed a shared philosophy around the new pension system. And it worked, and it was an amazing reform, and it worked for some time. But then, in a way, nobody in India thought to take effort, that the community mattered. But actually, that community is the key. And this attitude that pensions is done, pensions is solved, we got the NPS, it's over. That's a very wrong attitude. Things only stay in place, when they are surrounded, when they're ensconced in that community that will watch this space every day, write blog articles, criticize the practical moves, be guardians of the ideas over long periods of time. And when the pensions policy community dispersed, we basically set the stage for the nonsense of reversing the NPS. We did a similar discussion around the journey of Indian finance. There was a 25-year episode where an amazing high quality intellectual community sprang up. There was a collaboration between people in the Ministry of Finance, NSC, SEBI, in academics, and so on. And a whole lot of things got done. And then that entire community was dispersed. And then one by one, many things started going wrong. Similarly, if you think about the years in the United States, that there was a time when, whether it was a Republican or a Democratic administration, there was a consistent approach towards world policy and communism and so on. And it worked because there was an intellectual community, there was a stable policy community, there were owners and guardians of that piece. And once you get to an administration that doesn't care about such niceties, then suddenly everything is up for grabs.
So, Ajay, tell me more about the applications of this framework into things beyond economics and governance.
A first great application is in contracting. Okay, now we are just private. It's contracting. Suppose we live rules rather than
I love to be private with you, Ajay Shah.
yeah. Suppose we live rules rather than discretion. Then we write contracts and we abide by contracts. Great. So the contract is written, it is taken seriously, and you will really work to live by your side of the contract, and vice versa. Suppose we have opportunistic renegotiation around contracts, or opportunistic adjudication around contract disputes. Then suddenly the whole thing breaks down, and now everybody is solving their game theory differently. This comes the clearest when there is an asymmetry of power between a firm 1 and a firm 2. And I've seen this vividly in India. Okay, there are many large firms who believe they have the power. So there is a large firm who is procuring some humble part, and they feel there are 100 firms in the country who are desperate to sell to me. And large firms in India behave really badly. They drive a hard bargain. They extract working capital credit from small firms, which I think is dumb, because the cost of capital for a big firm is low. It should be upside down. If I was a large firm, I would pre-commit to the small firm that I guarantee swift, efficient payments to you, because the cost of capital there is lower. I'll get a better price out of that. Or large firms in India just do gundagiri, that they will opportunistically misbehave. No, that was the contract, but we are not doing this. Now we want this. And the small firms are just expected to, bear what they must. Now, this is not free. So this is again the error of strongmen. Here, the strongmen are sitting inside large firms who believe that this kind of opportunistic behavior is a good thing. They derive their pride from it. It is their machismo. They have 3 beers and tell stories about how I'm so great, I kicked this guy around. But there is the other side in the story. Now, when small firms are treated like this, they weave that into their expectations, and they start systematically shading their bids in the competitive procurement process. So large firms are not getting contracts at the same price as the firms that behave well. So it's opportunistic and short term to think that in one procurement, in one situation, I will screw you over and I'll get an unusually good deal. But like, what about the future? You're going to be there for a long time. So there's a completely wrong view of power asymmetry and how it is abused amongst simple-minded business people in India. Whereas I would actually flip it around and say, look, you're in a repeated game with your vendors. You're better off behaving with your vendors. And in steady state, when you run an auction, you'll get better prices. Again, strongmen, the machismo of the powerful people in the Indian firms, believe they will negotiate, they will drive a hard bargain. Like, dude, you're not going to improve on an auction. Okay, in economics, there is a reason why auctions work so well. So all the knowledge can be embedded in a competitive auction. And then the price that will be the best price you get in an auction is contingent on your behavior. When you live by rules, when you don't cheat with people, when you don't screw people over, you will get better prices in your purchases. My next example comes from criminal law. This is the debate around sentencing guidelines. Okay, so we know that a crime has been committed. The prosecution has proved that a crime X has happened. There has been a global debate around the magnitude of the punishment, that should there be more written down sentencing guidelines or not. The argument is, oh, but the judge should have discretion. There were some attenuating factors. You have to look at this person, and because this person is such a good person, you should give them a more lenient punishment. And then this again gets you into this whole uh, rabbit hole, that people understand that, oh, the punishments are a little flexible, and now all kinds of problems open up. There could potentially be concerns around the fair play and the behavior of the judiciary. There could be a behavior by a potential criminal who could think, maybe I'll get away with a lower punishment, and you're just opening a Pandora's box. And so again, rules versus discretion, that it's better to have more application of sentencing guidelines. My third is in international relations. International relations is a lawless space. You cannot sue another country. So, what's a treaty? Are you going to abide by a treaty? Or are you not going to abide by a treaty? It will always be attractive for a strong man to unilaterally back out of a treaty, to renege on a treaty. And the strongman feels very good, and the supporters of the strongman are celebrating that, oh, my guy is so powerful, he walked out of a treaty. But there's no free lunch. Now suddenly everybody else that is in a treaty with your country will be thinking, oh, but these guys can't be trusted, and 100 actions commence that will ultimately harm the interests of the country. So the entire international relations world runs on rules rather than discretion. You remember we did an episode on hybrid warfare where some people think that, oh, I'm so hot in my machismo, I will trigger cyber war against Bhutan, where overtly I'm not in conflict with Bhutan, but secretly I'm messing up the payroll system of the Bhutanese government. I mean, yeah, you can do that. But in the long run, there are no secrets and everybody knows everything. And the Bhutanese government will turn around and start changing their behavior vis-a-vis you. So inflicting hybrid war upon other countries is actually the strategy of rogue nations. It is not something any sensible country should be doing. So that again is rules rather than discretion, that you're better off not being opportunistic. You're better off not being exploitative. You're better off playing by rules of the game, because actually there are hundreds of treaties that are at stake. And finally, I want to come to parenting. Okay. So many things about parenting are this tension between rules and discretion. So here's an example. A parent says to a child, if you do X, I will punish you. Now, no parent actually ever wants to punish the child. Okay, parents love their children. So when the time actually comes for the punishment, it is very, very tempting for any parent to say, like, okay, just let it be. That's human nature. And yet, when you do that, actually, you've lost all your credibility, you've lost your commitment. So again, words like credibility, commitment come into play. So what works in parenting is not infinite discretion. What works in parenting is some systematic predictability of rules, where children are shown some guardrails in a predictable way. I'm not saying micromanage them. Again, what is a rule is a sophisticated question, but the debate should be around rules. And then once some rules are established, there should be reasonably predictable behavior around the rules, and the rules should evolve gradually, rather than a world of all discretion, that if I'm not in a mood today, I'll say yes. Or if I'm in a good mood today, I'll say no, and so on. Then the children actually get more confused and messed up. And then the children start thinking, how do I game the parent to get something done, which is just a lousy place to be.
I want to add a further dimension to this, which ties in with how I began the episode. And I want to bring this to the personal domain. When I was young, I was a rebel without restraints, right? So I would stay up late, I would work for 3 days in a row, I would have beer with my friends when I felt like it, I would not exercise, I would eat any shit, etc., etc. And now I've realized that all of it is actually not conducive to rebellion. It actually works against it, it's counterproductive, right? If you want to do bold, imaginative things, if you want to be an independent thinker, an independent doer, fight against convention, all of those are wonderful things, and all of those require rules, and rules set by you yourself. Like what I attempt to do now, I don't always succeed, but what I attempt to do, what I aspire towards, is having a set of rules which can help me be the best version of myself. So that involves, sleeping at least 8 hours hours a day, making sure I get enough REM, enough deep sleep, etc., etc. That involves being predictable with meal timings. That involves being careful about diet and not indulging too much, especially after my recent health episode. That involves trying to get enough exercise in, where frankly, I have, it's do as I say, don't do as I do, because I have to get my act together there. But I think it's important to have all these rules which then act as a scaffolding from which you can launch, from which you can take off, right? When Elon Musk sends his rocket and then when it comes back and it's caught so beautifully by those engineering contraptions, there are millions and millions of algorithms and rules that go into that enable that flight into outer space to take off. So to really reach our full potential, we need those rules too. Those rules aren't constraints. They help us become the best version of ourselves. And in a sense, just as, you know, I think of the Constitution as a set of rules as really rules to constrain the state and not to constrain the people. Similarly, I think of the rules on myself as rules to constrain my bad habits and to constrain all the things that can go wrong, which automatically then enables me to be at my best.
Be quiet and predictable in your life so that you can be explosive and creative in your ideas.
So pithy and nice. Have you ever considered Twitter? Have you ever? You could be quite. Next episode.
So I want to end this with the core idea that you and I have this deep intuition through our entire life that it is a common human failing to look for a strong man, to look for a state that is a my bap that will exercise discretion, and I have this fatuous delusion that the state will exercise discretion in ways that are good for me. Okay, and that's just a completely wrong idea. We've been through many dimensions of it, but this is one of the most beautiful and subtle and interesting ideas, that it is better when the state operates through rules rather than discretion, and that civil servants and politicians discharge their responsibilities of well known and well understood rules rather than imagining and creatively coming up with a firefighting solution to each situation that they see, and opportunistically exploiting every possibility that they see. And then again, you should be thinking that what should the rules be? So a good country is one where the best and brightest people apply themselves to imagining those rules. So just think like Constituent Assembly. Just think like imagining the NPS, imagining the inflation targeting. In a good country, the best and brightest people apply themselves to finding those good rules that are incentive compatible, that create conditions for the blossoming of the private sector and the private economy.
At this moment, I want to point out to gentle readers that for everything that you're saying about strong men, you are a strong man yourself. Ajay Shah, follow my instructions. Put your arms on the table like this. Roll back your sleeve. Roll back your sleeve. Flex your bicep. Show your bicep. Namsita, can we zoom, please? Yeah, just zoom in. Yeah. You can see the bicep? These are incredible biceps, and they have come about not because you randomly did whatever exercise you felt like, but because you followed a rules based regime.
Very well. I want to recommend an exercise machine.
Just because we got you to show your biceps, what is that exercise machine? Tell us, Ajay.
It's a rowing machine. Okay, so if you had to be a lazy bum and if you had to be a sleepy Bengali, and I got you to sign on to only one exercise, then it would be a rowing machine.
बेइज्जती कर दी मेरी बेइज्जती कर दी ठीक है बताइए बताइए
The rowing machine is, of course, cardio exercise, and it uses something like 80% or 85% of all the muscles of the human body. So if you want to be lazy and do only one exercise, it is rowing. So I recommend everybody should do more rowing. As an aside, the commonest machine in the world that is used in rowing is called the Concept 2.
So, my proclivity towards Bengali melodrama makes me immediately become a rowing machine, but the Hindi row. I feel like weeping copiously and becoming a rowing machine because of all these slurs that you're casting upon me and my fellow Bengalis. Listen, we gave you Robindra Shongit, which was admittedly a long time ago, and Shuktujit Rai, right? What has Gujarat given us? A diet that is guaranteed to produce diabetes. Well done. And my recommendation for today is a great book that actually speaks to exactly what we're talking about, The Calculus of Consent by Gordon Tullock and James Buchanan. And it's a masterpiece. It's not an easy read, but it's one of those fundamental, foundational books that everyone who wants to understand the field should read. So there you go. I am recommending a geeky, scholarly book, and he is recommending a rowing machine. This is a new side to Ajay Shah. This is a man of action. So I guess the second half of your life will be more action than thought, right? Am I right?
I'm the same.